Hey everybody, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries, and in today's video we are going to be discussing what I am calling the Zionist Jesuit connection, or this could just as easily be called the Jewish Jesuit connection. So what we're going to be talking about today is how these two sides of the New World Order conspiracy, which I have talked about in other videos. I've talked about the Roman Catholic side of this conspiracy, and I've talked about the Zionistic Jewish side of this conspiracy. In this video, I am going to be laying out what I have discovered in my research of how I believe around the time of the formation of the Jesuit Order in the early 16th century that we see that these two occult streams that I believe have been separate converge together. So today's video is all about documenting the progression of these secret societies. Today is going to be a very historical video. It's going to be a video that covers a lot of history. And what I might do is I might have a part 2 to this. It's going to depend somewhat on the reception of this video and if people would like to see this or not, because I would really like to go even further and talk about how the convergence of the Jewish and the Roman Catholic sides of this conspiracy together with the formation of the Jesuits leads into things like the development of what we would call futurist or dispensational eschatology, which also ties into Masonic eschatology. Most people don't know that Freemasonry does have an eschatology, but a lot of these themes surrounding the building of a third temple in Israel and the coming of a future messianic figure that dispensationalism would probably call the Antichrist. These themes all go back to the religion of Judaism, and it goes back to Jesuits developing this theology and inserting it into Protestant and evangelical circles. So that would be part 2 if we get to that point. But today we need to lay the groundwork first to say, how has this conspiracy come together? Now, those who have watched my channel for a long time know that I have talked about how I believe that the Jesuits in the Vatican and the popes of Rome are at the very top of this New World Order conspiracy. That is what I have always said, and I still hold to that. I hold to the historicist mode of Bible prophecy. I'm a historicist post-millennialist, and I believe that the Church of Rome is very central in Bible prophecy, and they are very central in what is going on in world events, and they are very central regarding how these secret societies relate to each other. Now, that being said, what my research has unraveled for me is that there is a very prevalent Zionistic Jewish side of this conspiracy that can be taught, is discussed in Bible prophecy, which I would call the synagogue of Satan. And I think that this video and this thesis I'm going to lay out, that there is a connection between the formation of the Jesuit order and the Jewish conversos that existed in the Iberian Peninsula around the turn of the 16th century, that this is going to be a very relevant video, even with things that are going on in world events. I was debating whether I was going to do some other video topics for this video. I'd like to do a deep dive at the Epstein files at some point. I also have a video related to cosmology I'd like to cover at some point. But even though this video isn't going to be directly related to the Epstein files, it's not directly covering that, because this video is going to indirectly, I think, be relevant to the times we are living in, because of the fact that what we've discovered with the drop of these Epstein files is it's what conspiracy theorists have been saying and suspecting and knowing for many years, and now has been confirmed by these government documents, that these terrible things are going on relating to the abuse of children. But what we've learned through this specifically, not only that these horrendous things are going on, but that there is a ritualistic or occult motivation or component to what these elites are doing. So this is why understanding the occult world, or understanding the secret societies, as Christians from a biblical perspective, I don't mean search occult books out. That's not what I mean. But I mean having a historical understanding of these things is more relevant than it ever has been. Because what I think historical circumstances, current events, the province of God is revealing to us is just how real this battle between spiritual good and evil is, and how these world elites really are serving a spiritual evil that the Bible describes under this umbrella of Satan and the fallen angels and the demonic forces of darkness. So these what I'm trying to say is these elites are not doing this for the sake of sex alone or other pleasure. They are doing these things with a ritual motivation as part of their secret occult religion. So understanding the progression of these secret societies is as relevant as it ever has been. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. That's what we're going to be covering. And as I said, the thesis of this video is that the men who founded the Society of Jesus, more commonly known as the Jesuit Order, that they were in fact men who were either sympathetic to the Jewish community in Spain, or that they were themselves in fact Jewish conversos. And we're going to see that one of the superior generals, the early superior generals, Diego Laynez, was in fact a Jewish converso, and that has been historically documented. I was glad that I received this book in the mail, and I also have a copy of this on my computer that I've been reading. And I know you can't read this super well, but the book is The Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews, Jesuits of Jewish Ancestry and Purity of Blood Laws in the Early Society of Jesus by Robert Alexander Merricks and edited by Andrew Cullen Go. And we're going to read a few quotations from that today. So there you see it held up to the camera. And that is the book that we are going to be documenting today. And so that's going to be very helpful. Before I get into all of this material any further, I want to start by reading a passage of scripture, Revelation chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. And this is a very fascinating portion of scripture because it ties into things related to not only this synagogue of Satan that is described here, but it actually talks about how this synagogue will end up having to give way to the advance of Christianity. So this is a very fascinating passage of scripture, and I think it's something that is prophetic. Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee. Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I will also keep thee from the hour of temptation, which will come upon all the world to try them that dwell upon the earth. So people who have been following my channel and who have watched my video on Zionism, I read these passages, Revelation 2:9, Revelation 3:9. They talk about these men. This is written in the first century, but this, I think, is applied in later portions of history as well, that they outwardly profess to be Jewish. This is a Jewish religion. They are of the synagogue, but they have an inward religion. They say they are Jews, but are not. And I think the secret religion would be the occult religion, the Babylonian religion, the Luciferian religion, ultimately. And if you want, I'm going to talk about this a little bit, but if you want more context on this, please watch my video on Zionism. And I also want to say at this point, if you want more context on the Babylonian roots of Roman Catholicism, because we're going to talk about that as well, please watch my video on Mystery Babylon. So Mystery Babylon for Rome, my Zionism video for the Jewish Zionistic side of this conspiracy. And this is really interesting. This is describing this is from the letters to the 7 churches in Asia in the 1st century, and it's talking about the Church of Philadelphia specifically here. But many people have described that this is absolutely, that these, some people believe, and I think there can be some credibility to this, that these churches can be typological of events that go on later in church history. You may agree with that, you may not. But it's interesting that when it talks about how these men who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan, so outwardly Jewish, inwardly Satanist, and it talks about in this specific passage that they will come and worship before thy feet, of the Church of Philadelphia, not worshiping the church, but worshiping in the presence before the church. And so what this would, what will you say, well, what would that be talking about? It would be talking about their turning to, that their opposition to the gospel and to Christianity is going to come to an end, which is something that I think is very, very fascinating. I don't want to get too caught up in the prophetic weeds. If you read Gill's commentary on this, and then he also talks about the temptation which will try all the world in Revelation 3:10. John Gill actually believed that this was talking about a future time in history. People who follow my channel know that I have a great appreciation for the Bible commentaries of John Gill. I believe they are outstanding. But I digress. I don't want to get too caught in the weeds on that. Like I said, we may do a part 2 to this, getting into the weeds of eschatology a little bit more. But today we're going to start by laying this groundwork that these two sides of this conspiracy, which I believe have always been, they have historically, for the most part, been separate. These two separate religions, so I'm not saying that the Jews created Roman Catholicism. That's not my thesis. I'm saying that these two religions, they have striking similarities to each other, and specifically that they both come from roots that are at their core Babylonian. And what we are going to see here is that they are going to start to converge together through the Jesuits, which have this foundation of being Jewish Conversos. And that leads to a greater infiltration into the Roman Catholic Church. It leads to a even greater emphasis on the works theology found at the Council of Trent. And it's going to help us to understand the progression of history, even with later events, how the Jesuits have really controlled Roman Catholicism for the most part for the past 500 years. And then even in modern events, they've really been spearheading things like the ecumenical movement, the interfaith movement. They were really instrumental with the Second Vatican Council. So when you understand this, you'll see that with the Jesuits in the 16th century, and then later groups like the Illuminati in the 18th century, that is really where these two streams start to come together and they start to converge together. So that's really where we're going to start today. So what we need to understand first, I can't go into all the detail I did last time, as I did in my Zionism video. You can go back and watch that. But what we need to understand is for the Jewish religion, that obviously when we talk about the Judaism of biblical times, there was always a remnant that was serving Jehovah faithfully. That has always been true. But when you look at the biblical history of what went on, that this Babylonian religion that we see through these idols, we see it through these false gods like Baal, Ashtoreth, Tammuz, the weeping for Tammuz, that these things were coming in to biblical Israel, and that many people were caught away with worshiping these false Babylonian gods. And when you understand this truth, this battle between that's typified by Babylon and Jerusalem, which typologically points forward to the battle between Mystery Babylon and the Christian Church, or the New Jerusalem in the New Testament context, it gives a lot of clarity to what is going on when you read all of this history in the Old Testament. And we see that, as I said, the worship of Baal or Tammuz, all of these things that were going on throughout the history of Israel, and then also the history of the southern kingdom of Judah, that is what is eventually going to lead in large part to what comes into the formation of the religion of the Pharisees. And then you have the Babylonian captivity. That's about 500 years before the birth of Christ. And when the Israelites went into captivity, there were those who were faithful and kept separate from the paganism of Babylon. We would see that with Daniel and his friends, and there were other faithful servants of that time. And then after the 70 years, we see a time of reformation, and dare I say even some revival under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, the building of the Second Temple, the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Many good things happen. But the context that you need to understand of that time is that even though some turned to the Lord in worship, there were others who brought a lot of that paganism out with them. And that leads to the formation of this religion of the Pharisees, which, as we pointed out in our video on Zionism, it was a very legalistic, evil, works-based religion that really, that the Pharisees, they were outwardly professing this religion that would seem to be the Old Testament religion that they had always worshiped, but they had inwardly developed these inner doctrines that they hid from the greater masses. And we read that from Edith Starr Miller in her book on secret societies. We read that quotation. And that really the rabbis that came after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, because we know the Pharisees, they plot to kill Jesus. We have the historical event of the death of Christ at the crucifixion, his resurrection on the third day. And then after they persecute the Christian church, and then moving forward, we have the destruction of Pharisaical Judaism that goes on in 70 AD. And then the rabbis that follow, they are really the continuation, the successors of the religion of the Pharisees. So we see these connections between the Talmudic religion of the rabbis, and it does go back through the religion of the Pharisees, and it goes back to the apostasy of Babylonianism. And another example of that, when we have the development of the Talmuds in the 5th and the 6th centuries AD, once again, the Babylonian Talmud compiled in Babylon, another connection to Babylon. So we've talked about connection to these gods of ancient Babylon in the biblical context. I'd encourage people to read Ezekiel chapter 8 to confirm that. We have the religion of the Pharisees. We have what happened with the Babylonian captivity. And then we have the development of the Talmud in Babylon around the 6th century AD. So that is the history. And then moving forward, we eventually get to the development of the Kabbalah in the 12th and the 13th century AD in the Middle Ages. So that is one stream. That is a Babylonian stream. And we read Revelation chapter 3 talking about the synagogue of Satan. So that is the one side of this that we need to understand. And now we come to the Roman Catholic side of this. And as I've already said, I believe that Roman Catholicism, I do see Mystery Babylon in many ways being fulfilled by the Church of Rome, and the mystery of iniquity in 2 Thessalonians 2 being revealed by the Church of Rome. But what we need to understand is that whether you agree with my prophetic views or not, historically, we can say historically Protestantism has always understood really the pagan and the anti-Christian and the heretical doctrines that entered into professing Christianity in the centuries of the patristic era and led to the formation, the papacy as we see it in the Middle Ages, and this leads to the false medieval Roman Catholic system that dominated in the medieval era. So we really need to understand that. I would say that there are many different elements that eventually entered into the Christian church, and that these different religious practices, such as you see influences from Babylon, as I've already indicated, Persian Mithraism, we see that come in. We see Greek and Roman pagan religious influences on the Church of Rome. Just think of the title of Pontifex Maximus that has been historically taken by the Pope. And that title goes back to the head of the Roman religion during the days of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. That Julius Caesar actually had that title as the head of the Roman priesthood, that he at one point held the title of Pontifex Maximus. And that also that title would be taken by the Roman emperors. So there's a lot of influences that are Babylonian. We can see this. Other pagan religions have had an influence. And I would even say there's also Gnostic influences and even Jewish influences on the Church of Rome. If I'm going to read from the commentaries of John Gill, who I've mentioned. So his commentary on Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, if you want to, you can go and read Gill's commentaries in their greater context. He was a historicist who did believe that the Church of Rome was the fulfillment of Mystery Babylon. But I'm just going to read a little short excerpt here just supporting what I just said. And he says, but it seems to be a part of the name of what follows. Babylon the Great, that is the great city, by which the Church of Rome may well be called because of the signification of it, confusion. And he quotes Genesis 11:9 here. And then this part specifically on the Church of Rome, Gill says, its doctrine and worship being a confused mixture of paganism, Judaism, and Christianity. So Gill understood that these practices had, from these various different non-Christian influences, had come into the church in the early centuries following the death of the apostles, and that eventually leads to the system that we eventually see being really solidified in a political sense by the 8th century around the time of Charlemagne. The ecclesiastical and false doctrines had started to come in long before that. It's a process that really came in gradually over the first 800 years of church history. So that is the context of, we see, this is the first point I've really wanted to establish, that in the Jewish religion, we see Babylonian influences there, and we see this same thing with the Church of Rome. So there are striking similarities, and they are both also, as I said, largely works-based. They do not understand the biblical concept of grace. And quoting specifically to the idea of the Church of Rome, it would be a religion that rejects the monergistic understanding of Calvinism, of the sovereignty of God, of salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. And as a matter of fact, those understandings of Christianity were condemned as heresy and condemned as anathema by the Council of Trent. So the Roman Catholic system is what we would call a synergistic system, relying on notions of free will. That would be more, we would call that more Arminian nature, contrary to the teachings of Calvinism. And ultimately, it's a works-based religion. It rejects the Protestant teachings of grace alone through faith alone, and that it is a religious works-based system that combines various elements, penances, and the teaching of purgatory, and confession to a priest, the necessity of the sacraments. That's what's called sacerdotalism. And we have all these other unbiblical things, such as the veneration of Mary, the veneration of the saints, praying to Mary, praying to the saints, the veneration of the popes themselves, the teaching magisterium of the church, all of those things. So as I've said, we've established the Babylonian side for both of these two streams, the Jewish and the Roman Catholic. But I do want to understand that I don't believe that one of these two groups has always controlled the other for most of history. When we look at history, especially in the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic, even though we acknowledge it has both pagan and even some Jewish elements to it, we need to understand that Jews were expelled from many Roman Catholic countries in the Middle Ages, and that they were largely hated by Christians, or let me say Catholics, in the medieval nations of Europe at that time. There was persecution that came upon these Jewish communities, and there was a very real negativity to those things. And some of that may have been because of the Jewish ritual practices, and some of that may have been from just an ignorant prejudice. It can be a little bit of both. History can be complicated. But we need to understand that these streams are largely separate. But as we're going to see here, we go to the progression of these secret societies. I'm going to start with the Gnostics. I'm going to work my way up through some of these intermediary secret societies to the Knights Templar, and then we're going to move forward to the Jesuits. We're going to see how some of this starts to converge together. We're going to see the progression of this. And I think this will be fascinating for people who are interested in understanding this conspiracy further. So all of that being said, I think we need to start with, there is even a connection between the first century heresy of the Judaizers, which really was similar to the religion of the Pharisees, and the Gnostic groups that came up in the early centuries following the death of the apostles. And if you want the connection to that specifically, I would encourage you to look up Simon Magus. And this is a historical fact that has fascinated me, that Simon Magus, that is talked about in the book of Acts, who was practicing witchcraft, who wanted to even try to purchase the power that was being put on display by the apostles. This very same man is historically considered the father of the Gnostic heresies. John Gill, I have it here, his dissertation on the progress of popery, he talks about how some of these practices, including the practices of Lent and the forbidding of marriage, the celibacy of priests, the worshiping of angels, a lot of these heresies were things that were practiced by the early Gnostic groups. And you can read in here specifically from Gill how he talks about how the early teachers of these Gnostic sects, like the Valentinians, whatever, that it is historically been an established fact that many of these early Gnostic leaders were taught by Simon Magus, and he is called the father of heresies. So that in of itself is a fascinating connection. And what we're going to see here is that the Gnostic teaching The Gnostics taught that we are not saved by salvation by grace alone, through faith alone in Jesus Christ alone, the biblical gospel. They believed that they were saved through their illumination, through a secret knowledge, a secret occult knowledge, an illumination. And what we are going to see here is that the teaching of Gnosticism is the same as the Illuminism of the Illuminati, and that the G in Freemasonry and Illuminati, largely the same occult stream, occult teachings, occult religion, that the G in Freemasonry, I have it here, if you can see this, that at the lower levels, they say that this G in Freemasonry stands for God, or it stands for geometry. But when you go to the higher levels, they teach you that it is in fact Gnosticism. So these things that we are seeing here we're starting to see connections between these groups. So this connection between the Judaizers to the Gnostics through Simon Magus is a very important connection that we are going to make. I might take this back down. We'll return to this later. There we go. So that's really our first connection that we're going to make. And as we move forward here, we're going to see that the teachings of the Gnostics, and there were many different Gnostic groups. I could do a whole video laying out all of these different sects. Getting into the literature of the Gnostics is very complex and complicated. So that's a whole video in and of itself. But we just need to move forward for the sake of brevity and time. But we do see that when we move forward in these centuries, so we're saying we started in the 1st century. We know that Irenaeus of Lyon come against the Gnostics. He writes his famous book Against Heresies, refuting the Gnostic teachings. So the early centuries, such as the 2nd century, the 3rd century, these would be really the first real group that is, through their doctrines, heretically combating the orthodoxy of the Christian church. And then when we get the rise of Islam, that's around the 7th century, 8th century, so 600s, 700s. That's the traditional dates for the founding of Islam would be, I think it's 610 AD. 7th century, you get these Islamic secret societies up. Now we're moving more into the medieval era. And these Islamic secret societies, such as the Ismailis or the Druzis, and then you get to this group called the Hashisin, or what we would call the Assassins. This is people who have played video games know Assassin's Creed, which talks about the assassins and the Knights Templar. They're taking this history of secret societies and they're making it contemporary for the youth who are playing video games. So that's really where a lot of that is coming from, is these groups that these Gnostic Illuminist teachings came through these various secret societies, and they find themselves in the Middle East. And then we're going to come to this group that we know as the Knights Templar that gets founded, and they end up having their headquarters on the Temple Mount, or at least on what is considered by many archaeologies to be the site of the Temple Mount. That's interesting that there can be the discrepancy of where the real temple was in Jerusalem. The Jews claim that the Wailing Wall is proof that the prophecies of Jesus, one stone will not be left on the other, is true. There's actually alternative thesis for where the true site of the temple was. So that's actually a very fascinating detour that we could go to into all of this history, a video for another day. But the Knights Templar are fascinating because they get founded in the Holy Land. They establish themselves on the Temple Mount, but they end up becoming extremely powerful. And they even end up establishing international banking, at least as we know it today. They get a lot of the kings of Europe to lend them money. And so by the 1300s, when they end up getting suppressed by the Pope and by the kings of Europe, they had become extremely powerful. And when they were suppressed, that they were accused of worshiping the Baphomet. They were accused of sodomy, of homosexuality. They were accused of spitting on the cross, devil worship, and occultism. And this is fascinating because what you need to understand, many secular modern historians have tried to either downplay or eliminate these accusations, saying a lot of these confessions came under torture after their arrest. They would say that this wasn't really what was going on. But when you get into the occult groups, such as Freemasonry, and these other occult groups, they believe that their origins go back to the Knights Templar. And I think the history does bear out that the Templars were guilty of the occult crimes that they were accused of. And if you go here, we're going to talk about this more. Coming back to this, this shows the degrees of Freemasonry here. So you have, these are the degrees of the Scottish Rite that were written by the Jesuits in Claremont College in the 17th century. And that's very interesting. So Knight Rosicrucians, that's very interesting. Knight of Royal Axe, Chief of the Tabernacle, Prince of the Tabernacle, Knight of the Brazen Serpent. Oh boy. I mean, you can just see this cult terminology in these things. But if you go over to the York Rite, and the York Rite is not as well talked about as the Scottish Rite. And I think the Scottish Rite is more prominent for a reason. There are reasons why the Scottish Rite is talked about more. But when you go to the York Rite, you see it talks about the Order of the Knights of Malta, which is still a very powerful Roman Catholic order to this day. A lot of the founders of the CIA were Knights of Malta. And that the Knights of Malta, they were first called the Knights Hospitaller, or the Knights of St. John. And as history progressed, they became the Knights of Malta. But then above them, there's 13 degrees in the York Rite, and there's 33 degrees in the Scottish Rite. The top one here is the Knights Templar. So groups like both the Rosicrucians and the Freemasonry trace their roots back to the Knights Templar. And the reason I bring up the Knights Templar here is because of the fact that when they were in the Holy Land, this is when they first got established. They existed for around 200 years. So starting in the 1100s, and then they go up to the 1300s. When they were first established, they had connections with these Islamic secret societies that were tracing these Gnostic Illuminist teachings had come through these groups to the Knights Templar. And they had contact in the Holy Land with this group, the Hashishin, or the Assassins. Like I said, that's that hidden history that they're giving to the masses through those video games like Assassin's Creed. Now, I'm not saying those games are historically accurate. They're obviously fictionalizing everything, the same thing they do with movies. But I'm saying they've taken some real history and they've tried to present it to the masses. And they do this with occult themes. They want to secretly reveal things a little bit of the time. This is something that occultists have talked about, how they want to gradually, slowly initiate the masses into the secret teachings. Occultists like Annie Besant and others, they've talked about this principle. But I digress. That's a whole other rabbit trail that we could go down. So, but we need to understand this, that we're going to see this, that the Knights Templar, they end up getting suppressed in Europe. We're in the 1300s. And there are these successor orders that we're going to talk about next, which are going to eventually lead to the Alumbrados movement. Alumbrados is Spanish for Illuminati. And we're going to talk about how all of these things converge with the creation of the Jesuit Order. So in the Iberian Peninsula, before it was unified as Spain, there were separate kingdoms. There was Portugal, there was the Kingdom of Aragon, and the Kingdom of Castile. And if you understand the history, Aragon and Castile eventually joined together. We learned this history in school. King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, they get married, their houses join together. They complete the Reconquista against the Muslims, against the Moors, and they unify Spain as a Roman Catholic country under their joint monarchy. This is the history of the Iberian Peninsula. But before we get to that point, going back to the 1300s for just a minute, we're going to work our way up to 1492 when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Okay, sorry. But what we're going to see here is that what happened was the Knights Templar were suppressed, and some of these kings in the Iberian Peninsula liked the Knights Templars, and they didn't want to lose them. So what they did was they founded these successor orders that took on different names, but some of these escaped Knights Templar entered into these orders, and they took on a lot of the same principles, even a lot of the same symbolism with the crosses. They were the very same type of knightly militaristic orders that the Knights Templar had been. And two of them specifically I want to mention. One is the Knights of Christ, which was established in Portugal. And famously, Christopher Columbus was a member of this order. And that when he sailed to the New World, assuming you're believing the traditional narrative of Christopher Columbus going to the New World, he sailed with these red Templar crosses. So we have this connection to the Knights Templar with Christopher Columbus. And many people don't realize that Christopher Columbus talked about how he had this dream for his order. They wanted to establish their control over Jerusalem and over the Holy Land, and that they believed that that would lead to the messianic promise of that in eschatology terms would be the millennium. It's very, very interesting. And actually, when I did my interview with George Hobbs, he alleged, and this may be true, I haven't confirmed this myself, he believed that Christopher Columbus was in fact a Sephardic Jew. I'm hoping to ask him more about that again if I get another chance to talk to him. But that was very, very fascinating. That came out in my conversation with him on the Fact Hunter podcast. So a lot of these connections are already starting to come together. And this complicated, convoluted story that I am telling is going to get even more complicated and convoluted. So now we come to this next group that's called the Order of Montesa. Motesa. You can look this group up. And they were founded in the Kingdom of Aragon in 1317. And they were very closely aligned to the sister order in Castile called the Order of Calvatra. And these were Roman Catholic knightly orders committed to helping with the Reconquista, all of these things. But what is going to be interesting here is that this order is significant to me because it's going to have at least a loose connection to the Jesuits, because one of the earliest founders of the Jesuit order, the founder of the Jesuit order is named Ignatius of Loyola. We'll talk more about Loyola in a minute. One of his close friends was a man named Francis Borgia. Now, Francis Borgia was the great-grandson of the infamous Pope Alexander VI, who was Rodrigo Borgia. And you look him up, Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, is one of the most infamous popes in history. That he is claimed. There's so many stories you can read about him, and there's been so much debate about what's true, what's not. There's claims that he bought his election. I think this is true, that he bought his election by essentially bribing all of the cardinals and paying them off, and that his papacy was a lascivious, extravagant, sexually depraved mess. There's claims of orgies in the Vatican. There is claims of just sexual depravity, even claims of incest. That's just gross and disgusting stuff. You can look it up on your own time. If you want to, you can get into those weeds. But he is considered, he is historically agreed to be just an egregious, horrendous pope. And he's the same pope that led the monks, Savonarola, to rail against the corruption of the papacy. And he led a religious movement of extreme devotion to he was calling for the renewal of Christianity. And some Protestants have claimed that he's some type of a proto-Protestant figure, Savonarola. I read a quote from Spurgeon once who said he preached a semi-gospel message. I don't even know what that means, to be honest. Other men say that he was just a complete fraudster, Savonarola. But this history is fascinating, that he was railing against this papacy of Alexander VI, of Rodrigo Borgia. And this history is going to get even more interesting because they came from Spain, the Borgias. And Alexander VI and his family, his sons, he had two illegitimate sons. He made one of them a cardinal, Cesare Borgia. They were accused by the Roman elites of their time. I don't know if this is true or not. They were accused of being Marranos, or being Jewish, of mixed stock, which is interesting. They were accused of being Jewish, and that was essentially an insult at that time. And that may have just been just a vague accusation made against them, and maybe no truth to it at all. Maybe there is. But what's interesting, one of the things that Pope Alexander VI did is that he famously allowed the Jews to come back into Rome. They had previously been expelled, and he allowed them to come back into the city of Rome. So for whatever his motivations were, there's some type of a sympathy here. But then when we move forward to his descendant, Francis Borgia, who's going to have this link to these other men that I'm going to talk about, this is going to get even more interesting. So, but I mentioned the connection between the Jesuits and this order of Montesa. Well, Francis Borgia had a brother named Pere Luis Galceran de Borgia, who was one of the grand masters of the order of the Montesa. So you have the one brother who's the order of this, he's the grand master of this order that has its links back to the Knights Templar, and this other brother who becomes one of the early Jesuits, and he eventually becomes one of the first three superior generals. So this is, as you're starting to see here, very, very fascinating. So what I'm going to do next here is I'm going to talk about how I'm going to talk about the Jewish connections that I've already started to mention to the Jesuit order. And we need to understand that the Jesuit order was founded by a man named Inigo de Lopez, more famous of Loyola. And his name, the Romanized version of his name that he is more well known by, is as Ignatius of Loyola. And Ignatius Loyola, he was first a soldier, and he famously got hit by a cannonball in the leg and was injured. And he's in this castle trying to heal, and he's bedridden. He can't do anything. He's forced to just read books to pass the time and try to get his mind off the pain of being hit by this cannonball in a siege. And what happened is that he asked the nuns or the monks in this castle for books on soldiers and wars, because he was supposed to be a cavalier Spanish aristocratic soldier type. And instead they said they only had books of religious figures, of monks and nuns and saints of the past. So that's what he ended up reading, which got him very inspired. And he ended up having visions of the Virgin Mary, and he became convinced that he was supposed to be a soldier for the Roman Catholic Church. And he expressly founded his order, the Jesuits, to be soldiers for the Mother Church, and that they were going to wage war against the Protestant heretics. So his order is really largely founded to fight against Protestantism. And there is a reason why the Jesuits are mentioned negatively again and again and again throughout the centuries by Protestant writers. That the Protestants well understood the threat that was Jesuitism, and they never have made their bones to get away from blowing the trumpet of alarm against the Jesuits. That's something that has been true for centuries now. But Ignatius of Loyola, what we're going to see here, there's two facts we need to see. That a number of his friends who came in and were early founders of the Jesuit orders were themselves Jewish. That's going to be documented in this book here, The Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews. And we also need to understand that he was at one point arrested for being a part of what is called the Alumbrados movement, Spanish for Illuminati. So I think I'll start with that quote first to see that the Illuminati wasn't actually founded in 1776. There was a group that was a successor group, the Bavarian Illuminati by Adam Weishaupt. But the Illuminati goes back earlier to the Iberian movement in Spain. And the Alumbrados movement was a religious movement that the Inquisition was suspicious of because its theology at points was considered heterodox and had Gnostic undertones. So here we go back to the Gnostics that we talked about before. And that Ignatius of Loyola was considered to be a part of this movement, and he was arrested by the Inquisition under suspicion of being part of the Alumbrados. And that there were a number of other Roman Catholic saints who were considered to be part of the Alumbrados movement, or at the very least under suspicion of it. And many of these people are today considered saints by the Roman Catholic Church, and even doctors of the church. So figures of special doctrinal importance to the Roman Catholic Church, such as Teresa of Avila, John of Avila, John of the Cross, and Ignatius of Loyola, whom I've already mentioned. These are all considered extremely prominent figures. These are the Spanish mystics of Roman Catholicism of that time, of the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th century. They were all considered to have connections in one way, shape, or form, or at least suspected of being connected to this movement. And what you need to understand is that the Inquisition of this time had a really difficult time trying to discern where the lines of orthodoxy and heterodoxy met in relation to this movement, because many of the people who were a part of this movement or sympathetic to it were in the Roman Catholic Church, and it got very, very confusing. So the quote here I want to read, I hope you can see this, here is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and this is the 9th edition. So this is the early 20th century. This is an excellent historical document showing how this used to be much more easily understood history about the Illuminati. And today it's considered historical. It's a conspiracy theory. It's delusional to believe in the existence of the Illuminati. Well, I hate to break it to you guys. It's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. One of the 9th edition is considered by historians to be an excellent historical document. So drink your milk. The Illuminati did exist. It does exist. Get over it. I'm getting on my soapbox here, but I've heard guys say this. Although the Illuminati doesn't exist, it's ridiculous. So yeah, I do have a bone to pick with that. So that sorry, I'm getting crabby in my old age, but let's read this here. You guys are going to find this fascinating. At least I thought it was. So Illuminati or enlightened is a title which at different times has been given to or assumed by various sects or orders of mystics on the ground of superior knowledge of God, of divine things, which they claimed. So that's the Gnosticism, the secret knowledge. Among these may be mentioned the Spanish Alumbrados or Alumbrados, when I can't pronounce Spanish, so forgive me, which arose about the year 1520, in which before its final disappearance about a century later afforded numerous victims to the Inquisition, especially at Cordova. Ignatius of Loyola, while a student at Salamanca, 1527, was tried by an ecclesiastical commission for alleged sympathy with its views, but he was acquitted with an admonition. Under the name of Illumines, a similar sect appeared in Picardy in 1623, and afterwards centered into close relations with the Guerinists or followers of Pierre de Guerin. But by its antinomianism, it soon provoked repressive measures, to which it finally succumbed in 1635. The history of another sect of Illumines, which appeared in the south of France about 1722. It is very obscure, but is said to have subsisted until 1794. And then the title of Illuminati has been popularly bestowed upon the Rosicrucians, famous secret society. We mentioned them in connection to the Masons and the Knights Templar, the Martinists, and the Swedenborgians. But one of the most recent, as well as the most important applications of this classic word, has been to denote a secret society or a semi-political, semi-religious order which made some stir in Germany, especially in the southern Catholic portions of it from 1776 to 1784. It was founded on May 1st, 1776 by Adam Weishaupt. Here's the kicker. Professor of canon law at Ingolstadt and an ex-Jesuit, and set before its general purpose and for the discouragement of tyranny, superstition, and ignorance in the furtherance of the cause of reason, freedom, and virtue. And they were instrumental in carrying out the French Revolution. The political clubs that were known as the Jacobin clubs was the outward arm of the Illuminati. So there's a lot more history we could go into, but we see the connection here between Ignatius of Loyola, the Spanish Alumbrados movement, and then we've seen now also its connection to the Bavarian Illuminati of 1776 with Adam Weishaupt, who was a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt and an ex-Jesuit. Very important connections. And we're going to get to this, that I'll say it now so I don't forget. Adam Weishaupt, he partnered with the Jewish Rothschild in the founding of the Illuminati. So at that point, this converging together of Roman Catholic and Jewish streams is solidified by that point. And the Rothschilds in the 19th century under Pope Pius IX, they become the official Vatican bankers. You can still even find this on a simple Google search. They haven't suppressed this history to that point yet. You can look up the Rothschilds being the official Vatican treasurers or bankers under Pope Pius IX. That history has been there. These two quotes here from the Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews, I put these quotes here. I could also, if I wanted to, I'm going to read them. I have the whole document here, so I could quote it from here if I wanted to, but I think it'll be quicker because this is a long document. I thought it'd be quicker just to I have the whole book here. I just did this for context so you guys can see. I wanted to show you guys that this is documented. But here we have the same quotation. So it's the same thing found in this book. It's the same thing found in the PDF I just showed you. I just put them here because it's going to be easier for me to read it, and it's going to be easier for you guys to see what I'm reading without having to scroll through over 300 pages in the other document. So here we go. All right. So this is page 78. And what we're going to see here is that this is talking about how this other man, we mentioned Francis Borgia, who we've already mentioned his at least potential connection to the Jesuits through the papacy of his great-grandfather Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI. And then we're going to see this main man, Diego Laynez, who is once again another of the first few Jesuit generals. You can look up Diego Laynez. He was a superior general of the Jesuits. He was a confirmed Jewish Converso. And what we need to understand here, this is the history that we've gotten into, in that in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella united the Kingdom of Spain under their Roman Catholic monarchy. And they established the Spanish Inquisition, which is a later formation of the Inquisition. It's similar to the earlier medieval Inquisition, but it was like a new iteration of it that arose. And what they did was that they expelled the Jews from their lands in 1492. Anybody who remained in the country who did not convert to Roman Catholicism was or even put to death. So there was many Jews in this era who converted, and they became Jewish conversos. But if you read the history of this, many of them outwardly adopted Roman Catholicism formally to avoid persecution, but inwardly continued to practice the Talmudic rabbinic tradition. So that is very fascinating, and that's going to tie in here because many of the early Jesuits, as I've been reading this book, they talk about how I don't have the names of all of them, but there are a number of early Jesuits who were a part of this. They were in fact Jewish conversos. And the historical question that arises is, were they secretly keeping their, they were outwardly being Roman Catholic, but inwardly they had their rabbinic Talmudic religion that they were practicing? I would say that they were. And that this influences not only the progression of, also by extension, it has a huge influence on the history of Roman Catholicism as well. So it's fascinating how these streams start to come together. And here we have historical documentation supporting what I said. And we're going to see that this man, Diego Laynez, who becomes the superior general of the society, he was in fact a Jewish converso. So obviously some of this context here is not going to make as much sense, but due to the anti-Spanish atmosphere in Paris, Nadal departed for Avignon 1537, where he received his doctorate in theology and was ordained a priest. From there, he finally returned to his native Balcarrick Island, where he experienced a long spiritual crisis that was deepened by an uneasy relationship with his wealthy family and death of his mother. Once Nadal was assured by a circular letter from Francis Xavier that the Society of Jesus was formally recognized by the papacy, he decided to go to Rome, where one of the first Jesuits he met was Diego Laynez. This is the man we were talking about, whom he had dismissed 10 years earlier in Paris. The latter did not become any less adamant and tried again to convince the former to make spiritual exercise in order to discern his vocation. In his unyielding efforts, Laynez was aided by Alfonso Salmeron, who may have shared with Nadal his excellent knowledge of Hebrew that the former learned as a boy in his native Toledo, right here, perhaps in the same Judeo Converso community where his close friend and biographer, Pedro de Rabanera, had been born 11 years earlier. So this biographer here, Pedro de, I can't pronounce his last name, Rabanera, he was Verso community, knew Hebrew, and then these two men, Diego Laynez, who becomes the superior general of the Jesuits, and this other man, Alfonso Salmeron, were both part of this Converso community as well. Here's the kicker, guys. Those are the two Jesuit theologians represented at the Council of Trent. Boom, drop the mic. Why is that significant? This is the very same council that anathematized Protestant theology, Reformed theology. So Reformed Truth and Ministry is a no-go with the Council of Trent, I'll tell you that. And this is significant. It's fascinating. Actually, in some of the conspiratorial corners of the internet, I have found even recently Roman Catholics who claim that Protestantism was a Judaizing movement. And they'll try to claim the scholarship of the Protestant reformers into Hebrew to study the Old Testament. There is a legitimate quote from Luther, which I think they are blowing out of proportion. Where Luther, I don't know, I don't like that he said this, but I don't think it reveals who he truly was. Where he did say the Bible is the true Kabbalah, and they've tried to claim that Protestantism is actually a creation of Judaism. You know, and I find that ironic because their theology is so much more closely aligned with the rabbinic works religion than the Protestant religion, which teaches salvation by grace. And so the Roman Catholic tradition is a works-based religion. And when you understand that the two most prominent theologians at the Council of Trent were Jewish conversos, a lot of this starts to make sense. A lot of this comes into perspective, doesn't it? And you can say, well, did they cast off their former religion? What are their motivations? We can go in even further into the weeds of history, and they suppress a lot of this history. So how far do we really want to go? But this is significant history, guys. This is research that I have found and I've wanted to share because this is so significant. But I'm going to move forward here. I don't want to get too stuck in the weeds. And then the second quote is later in the same book here. But it's basically just confirming what we've already said, that Diego Laynez was a converso. Polanco reported in a letter to Oliverio Manarco that the results of voting brought much joy and consolation to all but Laynez, neither for the electors or no for the Judeo-phobic Pope Paul IV, who approved the election with the moving speech, was Laynez's convergio lineage. So the context of this quote is this is when Diego Laynez was he was elected as the head of the Society of Jesus, and this quote here is confirming his Jewish convergio lineage. And then at the public occasion, they made an impediment to his election to the highest administrative post in the Society of Jesus, despite the discontent of the Spanish court and the attempts of later Jesuits to conceal it. So because of this culture, and there were even these blood laws, in Spain at this time, there was a very strong anti-Jewish bias in Spain at this time historically. So we need to understand that. And so the Spanish court was not thrilled about this. And later Jesuits, because they knew this stigma, tried to hide this fact. And this book is historically documenting that this is a reality. So that becomes so fascinating. And as we move forward in history, so we got to understand the Society of Jesus was started by Ignatius Loyola in 1534, and they also were confirmed as an order in 1540. And so what we need to understand here is that as we move forward here to the 17th century, so just about 100 years later, even less, that's when they start to develop the degrees of Freemasonry. And many conspiratorialists have shown that Freemasonry is actually, it has so much of it is stemmed in Judaism. And when you look at the imagery of the Masonic Lodge, I wish I had more pictures here, but I don't. You always see the pillars of the Temple of Solomon. And what is Israel trying to do? They're trying to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. The imagery of the Masonic Lodge goes back to the Temple of Solomon. And what they are doing is that even Albert Pike famously said that the Kabbalah, Jewish mystical religion of Kabbalah, is the foundation for the entirety of Western esotericism. So there are these connections here. And I've always thought about that. I'm like, that's so strange to me, because I've always said the Jesuits, who are Roman Catholics, are the ones who wrote the high degrees of Freemasonry, not the Jews. But when you understand this history that I laid out, that starts to make so much more sense. And so we see all the connections between all these groups, between the Illuminati and the Freemasonry. We already read about how the Freemasons were infiltrated by this Bavarian Illuminati. That was his goal, was to use international Freemasonry as his outward tool to foment these revolutions that would bring about Adam Weishaupt's goal for a one world government, a one world religion, a one world order. So all of this history starts to connect when you understand the conversion of these streams, the Zionist Jesuit connection. That's the point. And then the Rothschilds, they team up with Adam Weishaupt, the Jesuit, and we've already seen the earlier Jesuit connections from the early 16th century. This is so prevalent. And if we got into more, this is what I would do if I do end up doing a part 2. Let me know in the comments, guys. But when you get into the literature of Masonic literature like Manly P. Hall, they talk about the rebuilding of the temple, the Masonic figure, the unfinished pyramid, and the all-seeing eye. It's the imagery. The below is the building, which is symbolic of the temple. The all-seeing eye, it can be either referring to the light of Lucifer, or it can be referring to this coming messianic figure that they are looking forward to, going once again to Israel and to the temple. We see these streams come to set together. We see the connections being made on these things. Significant, important. This is what we need to understand. So guys, this is really the video I had for us today. I wanted to really make these connections for everybody. I wanted to show everybody really where we're at in the stream of history. So this is really what I wanted to lay out in an hour. Like I said, if I do go into a future into this, I'll really show the Masonic roots of dispensationalism and Zionism and how that connects to the material I laid out today. That would be what part 2 is. So let me know, guys. Let me know what you think. I hope this video has been helpful. I know it's been important. I've been doing some slightly more political things recently. I've done a timeline on the progression of the New World Order, trying to cover both sides of this conspiracy. That is available on my website. And I've also written an anti-New World Order document called the Christian Liberty Declaration for Christians to read. And I would really encourage like-minded Christians to read that. And I'm even been trying to get some counsel from some of my friends that maybe we should even try to get people to sign that document, because I've been blessed to get some really positive feedback. So really been trying to lay out this conspiracy for people, really trying to say, hey, we need to wake up and see this. This is relevant to current events, current stuff that's going on with Epstein files, MAGA, Trump, what we talked about with our friend Peter Bolin with ICE, the tyranny in the United States. All of this stuff is relevant to what we're talking about. So when you understand this conspiracy, it really lays out a lot of this stuff. So that's really what I have for us today, guys. This is really what I have. I hope you've been blessed by this video today. I hope it's been helpful. And yeah, this is what I got for us today. This video has been the Zionist Jesuit conspiracy, and this is me, Joe Harper, signing off. So God bless everybody.
If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.